Aw, man, Emily, I love listening to old musicals.
Really, Gerald? God, that is so refreshing. You know, kids these days seem to think that musical theater history started with, like, Rent or something.
Oh, no, I'm talking like really old. Like I just finished listening to this musical called Cats, and that's from 1982.
I was born in 1982.
I know. So old.
So, Gerald, you're telling me that you think musical theater history started in the 1980s?
Well, does anything before Andrew Lloyd Webber even count? Emily? Are you okay? Is this the Broadway fangirl coming out again?
Oh, it's much worse than that, Gerald. It's the Broadway history teacher!
Emily, what do you call this look?
Drama teacher chic. Come, Gerald. It's time to take you on a magical journey through the history of old Broadway.
Yeah.
Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me to Herald Square.
Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I will soon be there. Whisper of how I'm yearning to mingle with the old-time throng. Give my regards to old Broadway and say that I'll be there ere
long. Okay, Gerald, and all of you out there, time for lesson number 1, the origins of Broadway. In the late 1890s, New York City was just as much a melting pot as it is today. Different cultures coming from all over the world and cohabitating on the same little island and bringing their various musical styles with them. Broadway has always been able to capture the zeitgeist, and this dates back to its origins, where the fusion of creative styles first came together. Still on the same street, but much farther downtown than the Broadway we know today, there were many kinds of cheap, popular entertainment to be found. First, there was Vaudeville, a type of variety show born out of France in the 1700s, but by the end of the 19th century, we turned it into something distinctly American. In fact, there was a time when it was the most popular form of entertainment in America, as the prices were low enough so anyone could attend. The concept was simple. Throw together a bunch of comedy acts and songs and you got yourself a show. Vaudeville was beloved by immigrant performers and audiences, and the parodying of ethnic stereotypes was also incredibly popular. There was no coherent book or structure. It was all about the individual act or performer. Some of the biggest future stars of musicals and films got their start in vaudeville, from George M. Cohan to Fred Astaire. Second, there were the European operettas, perhaps the closest still living relative to musical theater as we know it. The difference is operettas were light operas, completely sung through, dealing with more comedic themes, and, you still had to sing like you were in an opera. And of course, they were considered much more highbrow than vaudeville. Operettas were all the rage in Europe, particularly in England, with the likes of Gilbert and Sullivan churning out hits like The Pirates of Penzance, HMS Pinafore, and The Mikado. Seriously, these Gilbert and Sullivan shows are so enduring and in the public domain, so you still hear them everywhere. Why, I bet you know every word to Modern Major General without even realizing it, Gerald.
What do you talk? I've never heard that song in my... I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England and I quote the fights historical, from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical.
Third, and most shameful, were the minstrel shows. Unfortunately, unlike vaudeville and operetta, this is the most homegrown style. Minstrelly consisted of white performers painting their faces black and performing exaggerated black stereotypes in blackface. These shows date back to before the abolition of slavery, and by the 1890s were still wildly popular. Besides the appeal, it was also a practical matter, as black performers were few and far between, and definitely not allowed to share a stage with white actors. Elements of the minstrel show were eventually appropriated into musical theater in subtler ways. The bowler hat, jazz hands, all from minstrel shows. Finally, if you had an act to perform in this era, then you better hustle down to Tin Pan Alley and get yourself a song.
Isn't Tin Pan Alley that new hipster cooking supply store in Silver Lake?
Yes, but it's also a stretch of blocks on West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in Manhattan, where all the song publishers set up shop at the turn of the 20th century. Songwriters like Irving Berlin, George and Ira Gershwin, Rodgers and Hart, Hammerstein and Kern, Cole Porter, Scott Joplin, and so many more all worked in office buildings on Tin Pan Alley, where producers and performers would shop around and buy new songs for a dime. These were the days before TV and radio.
And Spotify?
Yup. So when you wanted to listen to your favorite song at home, you had to sit down at the family piano and play it. Buying sheet music was totally the gay 90s version of finding your karaoke track on YouTube.
So, if you went to Broadway at this time, you couldn't just walk up and see Mamma Mia or Oliver or even Oklahoma. No musicals with exclamation points at all. Just a bunch of different acts that represented a bunch of different styles?
Sort of. With songwriters selling their wares out of Tin Pan Alley and the establishment of the modern theater district, Times Square, in 1904, musical theater began to take shape with two nebulous forms: the musical revues and the musical comedies. Musical revues were essentially vaudevillian, comedy acts interspersed with musical numbers, big and small, with no libretto or connection between the acts. Musical comedies had a through line and a coherent story, but the songs rarely had a connection to the text. If you take the songs out of these early musicals, it doesn't really matter to the story, you know? The book was just a flimsy excuse to get to the songs and dances. For example, George M. Cohan, one of the biggest vaudeville stars at the time, made his Broadway debut in 1904 with Little Johnny Jones, a musical he wrote, composed the music for, and starred in.
Like an old-timey Lin-Manuel Miranda?
Totally, Gerald. But more importantly, though, Little Johnny Jones was one of the first examples of a full-length American musical comedy, churning out hits we still sing today like The Yankee Doodle Boy and, of course, Give My Regards to Broadway. Cohan's brash, pushy, very American style would come to define musical theater, as is evidenced by the fact that he's the only musical performer who has a statue in Times Square.
Wow, Emily! Musical comedy, vaudeville, operettas. There's so many things to see on Broadway in the early 1900s. How could you choose?
Well, Gerald, what if you could combine all those elements into one showcase under one roof? That was the bright idea cooked up by one Florenz Ziegfeld Jr., or rather suggested to him by his then-wife, the Polish singer Anna Held, who thought the French idea of the folie bergère would translate well to America. Ziegfeld loved the idea and expanded on it by adding the distinctly American elements of vaudeville, operettas, minstrel shows, and musical comedy, then cranking them up to 11. In 1907, the Ziegfeld Follies took Broadway by storm, and Ziegfeld was dubbed the impresario extraordinaire of Broadway. Cameron Mackintosh, Hal Prince, mere imitators compared to Flo. If you were in a Ziegfeld show, then you had it made. It was the goal of every performer at the time. The Ziegfeld Follies took the idea of vaudeville and classed it up with elaborate production numbers, costumes, set pieces, and, of course, tableaux vivants. There were novelty and comedy acts from the likes of W.C. Fields, Eddie Cantor, Bob Hope, Will Rogers, Ray Bolger, Marilyn Miller, and Ed Wynn. He acquired songs from the most iconic composers on Tin Pan Alley. He made funny girl Fanny Brice a star. The Follies also broke color barriers by hiring performers like Josephine Baker and Bert Williams, a black minstrel show performer who created the cakewalk. But most notably, there were the Follies showgirls, whom every American white girl aspired to be. They were 6 feet tall, and they had to nail that distinctive Follies walk, which required stretching their arms to the side for balance to accommodate the grandiose headdresses. For the next 20 years, Broadway was the most popular form of entertainment in the country. 1917 brought us into World War I, and some of the most patriotic shows, songs, and reviews were created at the time. 1921 brought us Shuffle Along, the first musical created by and starring black performers. Dance crazes like the Charleston and the Varsity Drag were from Broadway shows, and the most popular Broadway tunes could now be shared with the entire country on the invention called the phonograph. But 1927 was by far Broadway's most successful year, with over 50 musicals opening, and 8 of them on the very same night. Even in our era of insane ticket prices and safe ideas, Broadway would never reach these heights again.
Emily, if these shows were so amazing and popular, then why don't we see revivals of them today?
Well, Gerald, anything written before 1927 is considered passé by modern audiences, or at worst, just completely unwatchable. No one today goes to the theater wanting to see an out-of-touch musical review with no connection to a coherent storyline. Our modern sensibilities have evolved from that. We want a story, characters, themes, plot, not just a showcase of songs or showgirls. We have a million other places to go for that nowadays. No, for our musicals, the show must have a book. That's why, when adaptations of these old shows do happen, they're usually a form of jukebox musical, taking the catalog of a composer and fashioning a new book around it, like Nice Work If You Can Get It did with the Gershwins. Or sometimes the creative team does some adapting of the text while also providing commentary, like the recent Broadway revival of Shuffle Along, retitled Shuffle Along, or the making of the musical sensation of 1921 and all that followed.
Oh, I get it. So was there something that happened? A watershed moment that made audiences realize they wanted more from their musical comedies?
Not a watershed, Gerald. A riverboat. And that riverboat came barreling towards Broadway on December 27th, 1927, and nothing would ever be the same. Showboat changed everything. Based on the book by Edna Ferber, with music by Jerome Kern, book and lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein II, and produced by Ziegfeld himself, Showboat was not a frivolous operetta or Cinderella story musical comedy. It was the birth of the book musical, tackling themes such as racial prejudice, politics, and relationships that don't end in happy endings. It featured an integrated cast of black and white actors, and one of the major plot points of the show was a scene where a character is outed as being the result of miscegenation. The songs were as iconic as they are today, from the upbeat Can't Help Lovin' That Man of Mine, to the hilarious Life Upon the Wicked Stage, to the heart-wrenching Old Man River. Sure, happy musical comedies would still exist after Showboat, but the goalpost had been moved. Serious subjects could be tackled on a Broadway stage, and though the text has had revisions throughout the years, there are some terms in the 20s that we don't really use anymore in polite society, for example. Showboat is still being revived, and it still holds relevance today. And those, Gerald, are the origins of Broadway.
Wow! That's amazing! I like it.
Gerald and students, your homework is to listen to the catalogs of Irving Berlin or the Gershwins or the entire score to Showboat. You can find it on Spotify, YouTube. There are a bunch of different recordings, and there's 2 film versions you can check out. Expand your musical theater knowledge, and it'll make you a better musical theater performer, I promise. Until next time, Broadway babies.
Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly.
I gotta love one man till I die. Can't help loving that man of mine.